take your Bibles and turn to the Book of Esther. That's where we will be tonight. For those of you who have the study guide, you will notice that the historical part of the study guide looks very similar to the one from Ezra and Nehemiah. Originally, Ezra and Nehemiah was one book in the Hebrew Bible, and when it got translated into the Greek, it became two different Bibles. Two different books. In our Bible, the English Bible, Esther follows Ezra and Nehemiah. But historically, it takes place right in the middle of Ezra and Nehemiah. So it just worked out that way. When they split Ezra and Nehemiah, they just left Esther at the end. We come to the end of the journey through the historical books of the Bible. Esther is not the last one chronologically, but it is the last one in the historical section of the Bible. Just a brief review for you. 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to Assyria. 605, Assyria falls and is defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, just Assyria and also Egypt, but Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon become the world power in 605 BC. But the tribe of Judah in Jerusalem was still very much aware of what was going on. They were still doing their own thing. And so they became under control of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar. And of course they rebelled. They rebelled one time. Nebuchadnezzar took some of them away captive. That was okay for a little bit, but people being what they are, they rebelled against Babylon again. And so 587 they rebelled. 586 Nebuchadnezzar says, that's it, you're going to go. So he destroys the temple, takes them away captive into Babylon, the 70-year exile of Babylon. That didn't last real long, because as world powers come and go, along came Cyrus, king of Persia. And so he defeats Babylon around 539 or so BC. And he becomes the world power and gives everybody the opportunity to go back home. And then we look at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which we would call the post-exile period. In the post-exile period, there's a number of different movements that take place. They return home in three different sections. When the Babylonian captivity was over and they started going back home, then Israel has never been a nation, an independent nation, until 1948. So over 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years, Israel was not a kingdom. But they do get to go home. They get to rebuild the temple. They get to rebuild the wall. And in 538, under that first leadership of Zerubbabel, he returns with a group of people, starts rebuilding the wall, starts rebuilding the temple. There is a rebellion. And you'll notice that there, between Zerubbabel and sometime in there, we know before Ezra returns is when Esther happens. So somewhere in the time of 486 BC to 465 BC, Esther, who is still in exile, because there's a lot of folks, even though they could have went back to Israel, did not go back to Israel. And so when you look at the exile of the Babylonians, you look at the exile, in Babylon, some of them had settled in. 70 years is a long time, 50, 60, 70 years. They had probably married, some of them had intermarried, some of them had established themselves, and they were comfortable in Babylon. And so Esther takes place in that time period. Then later on, Ezra goes in, restores temple worship, and then later on, 13 years later, Nehemiah comes along. You'll notice in some of the dating of the kings and some other things, there's a long spread of times and dates. And so exactly when some of this happened, we're not real sure, but some of it we are fairly sure of. And so at the bottom of the study guide is a list of the kings of Persia. Cyrus the Great becomes king in 576, but that's not when he becomes the world power. It takes him a while. And so even though he is living during those times, he lives all the way up to 530 BC. 530 is when he dies, but he's already returned some of the exiles. Then Darius comes in after a period of time and lets the temple construction resume. And then we have Ahasuerus, which is also called Xerxes. Now, Xerxes was the king when Esther became the queen. Now, it's interesting that the Bible, if you'll notice, when you read in Esther chapter 1 and verse 1, it talks about the king who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. That's a long way, all the way around and up and through the Fertile Crescent and all the way down to the east coast of Africa and that whole part of the known world. The Bible has a name for him, but his real name would be Xerxes, because his name actually, when you look at Xerxes, that is the Greek name of the Persian king. So the king of Persia here, it says in verse 1, Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So how do you end up with two names in verse 1? It's simple. One of them sticks with the Persian name, and the other one translates into Xerxes. So you have those two in history today, in history books today, but the same person. It's just the Greek form of his Persian name is what he is known for secularly in the world today. And so that's who we are looking at. And so when he becomes king, we're going to start looking in a minute at his first queen, and then we will come back to Esther. But Artaxerxes later on followed him 465 to 424. Artaxerxes becomes king, and he is king during that period. He is the king during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And then he supports the rebuilding of the temple, supports rebuilding the wall in Jerusalem, and supports funding, gives Ezra and Nehemiah basically a blank check to go do what you need to do and go back and rebuild Jerusalem. We don't hear much more about Artaxerxes. We don't hear much more about Babylon, Persia, Israel, or anything else. But what we do know is around 331, Persia falls to the Greeks, the father of Alexander the Great. So even Persia, who defeated Babylon, eventually gets defeated. Babylon, who defeated Assyria and Egypt to become a world power, what happened? He got defeated. So there are a change, continual change of world leaders back then. And so you have that little bit of background. So I wanted to give you that because as we come to the close of the historical section, just understand that all throughout history, God has been present, God has been active, and we have seen in our study from Genesis right on up to the end of the historical books. What's going to happen next week is we will go to the book of Job and begin the period of the writings, the section in the Bible of the writings, and then we'll move to the prophets. Well, here we are at Esther tonight in chapter 1, verse 1. As I've already told you, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, because he was the one that reigned over that big kingdom. He was the world power. Now, verse 2 says, in those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel. Today, that is in Iran. It is, as a matter of fact, Babylon is south of Baghdad, Iraq. And so if you go about 300 miles east of that, you will cross over into Iran, and you'll come to a little town today that is not Shushan, it's more Shush, or as we would say in the South, Shush. Shush, be quiet. But Shush is the name today of the town that we are talking about. That was the king of Persia's dwelling place. And so with that historical, geographical background, we look at Esther and find out that her Persian name, as captives were, they were given new names. Her Persian name was a star. But in the Hebrew, Esther means myrtle. So probably already heard this. It is the book in the Bible that God is not mentioned. You don't have a mention of God there. He is never mentioned. Matthew Henry says in his interpretation and commentary, says, if the name of God is not there, his finger is. So God is present in here, and we'll learn some lessons from that later on. It's interesting, the Book of Esther was not actually canonized until very late, hundreds of years later, because of the absence of God being mentioned. It's interesting that in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found 1948, 1947, 48 in Israel, at Qumran, those Dead Sea Scrolls contains fragments of every Old Testament book in the Bible, except, guess what, Esther. Esther is not a part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are partials, fragments, pieces of every other book in the Old Testament, even some complete scrolls of Isaiah. So give you some idea about the fact that Esther is not a book that tells us about God by calling him by his name. But it's interesting as we move on, how did God use Esther to preserve and protect and save his people? Look at chapter 1, verse 2. It tells us a little bit about that. In verse 3, it was the 3rd year of his reign that he made a feast for all of his officials and servants. I'm not going to read all of this to you, but let's jump down to what's going on. The Bible tells us here in verse 7 and 8, the king has had a big party. He's invited a lot of people. Leaders of other countries are there, and they're drinking. They're getting drunk. And one of the interesting teachings of chapter 1 is simply this. Verse 11 says, verse 9, the queen, Vashti, had gone over and she's having her little party and banquet with all the wives and some women. Well, verse 11, the king orders to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people of the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. Out of custom, out of character, and women were not seen in public. What makes it more interesting is he just wants to show off his queen in the royal garments, or wearing her royal crown. And maybe the whole garments, he wants to show everybody how beautiful she is. But in order that he to show her her beauty, and the Bible says here, but she was beautiful to behold. What's verse 12 say? She says, I'm not going. She refuses to go. And of course, this makes the king furious. He gathers his people, his advisors together and say, what? They know he's angry. The king has commanded the queen, and the queen says, no, I'm not doing that. So they say, what do we do? Well, the kids and the young people and his advisors say to him, verse 16, not only has she wronged the king, but she has set a terrible example. Women are supposed to do what the men tell them to do. You think? Well, and what the advisors tell the king is, verse 17, the queen's behavior will become known to all women so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes. So in other words, his advisors are saying, if you let the queen get away with this kind of action, this kind of behavior, every wife in the kingdom are going to despise their husbands and think they have permission to disobey whenever their husband says something. And so he writes in the law of the Persians and the Medes, and verse 19 says, let it be recorded, let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. And so the king out, proclaimed throughout the empire. Verse 20 says, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. It doesn't matter if you are the king or you're a rich man, whoever you are, or even if you are a poor man. The edict goes out, the decree goes out, written in the law of the Persians and Medes, that that wives will honor their husbands, great and small. Whoever the husband is, his wife is to honor her husband. And then I see humor in some of these things, but he sent the letters out. It's interesting. The rule that goes out, verse 22, basically says this big edict, the orders go out across the land. Verse 22 summarizes it. Each man should be master of his own house. That's the new law. The man's the head of the house. So y'all remember that. That's what that king said. And so regardless of whoever they are. Now this is the first queen. So when we think about Esther becoming queen, what happened to the first queen? The first queen told the king, no, I ain't going over there and show out in front of your guest. So she is replaced. So after a bit, they have this, well, who's going to be the queen contest? And so they line up a lot of women. Esther was serving in the king's house. Verse 7, we get introduced to Mordecai and to Esther. Verse 7 of chapter 2 simply says, Mordecai had brought, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. So his uncle's daughter then is his first cousin. For she had neither father nor mother. And the last part of that verse says, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So he had raised this girl. He was her uncle, but he had taken her in. He had raised her. And she is one of the ones selected to go before the king to audition to be the queen. And Mordecai says, now, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. Don't tell anybody of your heritage or your family or anybody. And so verse 10 says, had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. So when we look at chapter 2, she goes on, she becomes queen. And verse 17 says, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she becomes the new queen. Now the last part of chapter 2 is interesting because remember now, the first cousin is the queen. Mordecai, the uncle, is still hanging out around the temple. He's still there. In verse 21 said, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on Ahasuerus. In other words, two of the guys have ill will planned toward the king. And so what happens, verse 22, simply, Mordecai told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now this comes back to be very important later on. And so when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. So verses 22 and 23 become real important later on when we get to chapter 6. What Mordecai just did gets recorded. It's in the book. Now, how many people sit around and reading history books? Well, it's there. It becomes important later on. Now, as we mentioned, Mordecai is sitting around the temple gate, and folks come and go. And Haman is an important person to the king. He comes and goes all the time. But for some reason, he expects Mordecai to bow down to him. He probably knows Mordecai is a Jew, maybe. But he is infuriated that Mordecai will not bow down. And Haman, of course, is furious. So he comes up with a plan. Verse 7. In the first month, which is in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur. That means to cast lots. Throwing dice. What are they doing? Throwing dice. Before Haman, to determine the day and the month. They kept on until it fell on the 12th month, which is in on the 12th month, which is in the month of Adar. This also becomes later on. This is all historical background in the book of Esther. So what's Haman doing? He's casting lots, throwing the dice to come up with a day. What's he going to do on that day? He can't do this today. He can't do it tomorrow. He can't do it next week. But he puts together a plan for the annihilation of the Jews. He knows Mordecai is a Jew. Mordecai will not bow down to him. Makes Haman so angry. He said, okay, your day's coming. He cast lots, threw the dice until they set the day on the calendar. And this plot is interesting because this day becomes very important. Verse 11 simply says that he goes to the king, lays out what he wants to do. And if it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And he says to them, I'll pay 10,000 talents of silver and bring it to the king's treasuries. To those who do the work and bring it into the king's treasury. So basically what's going on is Haman is planning to make the king rich. That sounds good to me. And the king says to Haman, the money and the people are given to you to do with them as seems good to you. So of course he's not going to kill everybody for nothing. But what he does say to the king, and he gets the king's approval, you can go kill them, take all of their stuff, and out of all of that stuff that you get, that they own, that belongs to the people that you're going to kill, you can do what you want to with it, you can do what you want to with the people, because what has Haman said? I'm going to bring you 10,000 talents of silver. And the king says, that's a deal. And so verse 11, the money and the people are given to you, and to do with them as seems good to you. And verse 13, the letters were sent by couriers into the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, children, women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. Why is that date of casting lots important? Hey, you got to get the word out, but it's going to happen on one day. So Mordecai knows about that. He hears about that. Probably, if you've heard anything at all about Esther, it's found here in chapter 4. Because in these verses, they're getting ready to kill and annihilate all of the Jews. Mordecai sends word and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews, sends word to Esther, the queen. Esther's response is, all the king's servants, all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put him to death. Except the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. And Esther says, and I've not been called. She knows, he knows, everybody knows. If you go see the king without being invited in, it's a death sentence. Unless he holds out the golden scepter and gives you permission to come in. That's a risk. Now here's probably the most famous verse in verse 14 in the book of Esther. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. In other words, Mordecai said, God's going to take care of his people. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come into the kingdom for such a time as this. This is probably a verse that a lot of secular people know. For such a time as this. This is your time. You may be right where you are right now. Who would have thought that a Jewish girl would become queen of Persia? But for just such a time as this. The first part of that verse, God's going to save His people with you or without you, but this might be God's plan for you. I know we're talking about Esther, but there's a truth, a foundational biblical truth here. God may accomplish what He wants to accomplish through you, and He'll move on and find somebody that will. It just may be that some of your richest blessings that God was going to bless you with, you didn't get because you didn't do what He wanted you to be doing, and He moved on and got somebody else that would do it. You don't know. But it just may be God's got you where He's got you right now to be a blessing to somebody. You just never know who's at work that needs to hear from God, that needs a message from the Lord, who needs maybe the message of salvation, or just maybe it's a Christian that's going through a tough time that just needs to know, yes, there's still a God in heaven. He's still on the throne. He still loves you, and He's going to get you through this. We live in desperate days and difficult times. Yes. Why are you where you are? It may be that just you are where you are for just such a time as this. She knows the risk. She knows she risked being executed, put to death. But look at the end of verse 16. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. I mean, she reminds him, I'm going to go, and you know it's against the law. But here's what she says. If I perish, I perish. I am going to do the right thing. And if I die, I die. There's a lot of Christians today who have opportunities, and all around the world we hear from Christians who are being martyred, who are being executed, who are being given an opportunity to renounce their faith, if they will. If they renounce their faith, turn their back on Jesus, then they will be allowed the opportunity to live. And you know what's happening around the world? Iran, Iraq, Somalia, Africa, China. They're holding fast to their faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and facing death and being executed. And so what's going on? And they attack the fathers, the husbands. So you have a lot of widows and orphans left. Men of God will not denounce their faith in Jesus Christ. So these couple verses probably are the most significant things you have ever heard from the book of Esther. But there is the foundation to this. How God has uniquely placed... Now God's not mentioned, you understand that. But for such a time as this, she is there. And she says, if I perish, I perish. So she begins to think about what she's going to do, how she's going to break the news to the king. Chapter 5, we look down at this banquet's been prepared, and at the banquet, the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Esther had the king's ear. What do you want? I will give it to you. Esther answered and said, my petition and request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king said. Haman goes out. He's there, but he leaves. Verse 9, Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, sees him again, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with toward Mordecai. This is an escalation of Haman's contempt and indignation against Mordecai. He walks past Mordecai. Mordecai doesn't bow down, doesn't give him any much acknowledgement. He doesn't stand or tremble before him. And it makes him mad. So Haman goes home. He talks about how important he is to his family. Verse 12, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I'm again invited by her along with the king." So he's quite an important man in his own head. He's talked about all that he owns, how important he is. He's telling his family that. And guess what he says? Verse 13. "Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Folks, let me tell you something. Don't get too angry with Haman here. And when you think, he's an idiot. I mean, he goes into the presence of the king and the queen, and he's got a banquet coming up, and he's a powerful man. He owns lands and houses. But this guy, Mordecai, this one person became the center of his universe, and he was so aggravated at him and had so much contempt for Mordecai that he totally lost perspective of all the good in his life. What's that say to you? What's that say to me? There's a lot of good in this world. There's a lot of good in us. We are blessed. We have so much going for us. And we'll let one little thing, one person, just irritate the joy out of us and make us forget and make everything else insignificance over this one person. A psychiatrist or a psychologist would give you a term called out of balance. Do you know what it's like when somebody's out of balance? When they become unstable? You know what it means when, it's a mental problem, it's an emotional problem. You can get so out of balance. When you look at your whole world and how good God has been to you and how blessed you are, but yet there is one little thing. It may be a person, it may be a problem, it may be a situation, but you let one little thing, no, it ain't little, it's the biggest thing in your life. So how can I call that a little thing? Well, you just open your eyes and you will find, isn't there there's a lyric in a hymn that says about when we turn our eyes toward Him, when we turn our eyes toward Jesus, and the things of earth grow strangely dim. What's that mean? All those big problems? No. Turn your heart, turn your eyes upon Jesus. And that helps balance out a whole lot of problems you're going to have. Well, Haman doesn't do that. He's angry. Haman forgets how important he is and how the king has, verse 11, the king has promoted me and he's advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Haman is an important man, except to Mordecai. So, his wife and all his friends. You better be careful where you get your advice from when you start listening to everybody. So what do they say? Let a gallows be made for him, 50 cubits high. And in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. And then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman. So he had the gallows made. So a big set of gallows. He's going to tell the king on Mordecai, who is of no real significance to the king. He's just another Jew. He was someone who is from the exile. He's not a Persian, he's a Jew. So, in Haman's mind, he's going to just simply open up to the king and say, this man is this, and this, and all of those bad things. Can I just hang him? And the king will say, yes, go ahead and do that. So that's how the end of chapter 5 ends. Basically, Haman has the gallows built for Mordecai. Remember in chapter 4, Mordecai has just told Esther, for such a time as this, may be why you are where you are. We go to chapter 6. And then the king has a restless night. Verse 1 of chapter 6. That night the king couldn't sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. So remember what I had said earlier about that plot the plot against the king? Mordecai says to Esther, tell the king there's a conspiracy against him. And so they do, and the guys get hung, and so that's the way that turned out. But interesting, remember I reminded you earlier, it's like, and it was written in the Chronicles. Just this little Jew revealed a plot, ends up, they get hung for treason. So, but he's having a sleepless night. So he sends for, and I'm sure there's more than one book of Chronicles. I'm sure there's more than one chapter. There's more than one page. Remember now, God's name is not mentioned in this. But it was found written in verse 2 that Mordecai had told of those two guys, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed upon Mordecai for this? In other words, he's reading, can't sleep, he's reading, goes back and reads about Mordecai. And so then he says to his people there, the servants, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? How have we how have we rewarded him? He saved my life. So what did we do for him? The king's servants who attended him said, nothing. Nothing's been done for him. So, now this is another one of these passages of Scripture that I find extremely humorous. So y'all just bear with me for just a minute. So, he just finds out nothing's been done. So the king said to him, Haman's in there standing in the court. The king said, well, let him come in. Now keep in mind, Haman has just built the gallows for Mordecai. He's impressed with himself. The king is in favor of Haman and everything is good. So Haman comes in verse 6. The king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? Now keep in mind, we're talking about, the king is asking, now how do I honor somebody that has just saved my life and I've done nothing to acknowledge what he's done for me? So he says, okay, Haman, what shall I do for the man whom I want to honor? Haman said, that's nobody but me. Haman answers the king. He said, for the man whom the king delights to honor, look at verse 8. Now this is Haman bragging on himself. Let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. And then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. That's what he wants to do. That's what he thinks they're going to do for him. Okay, are y'all following along with me on this? It's like, yes, that's what he's going to do for me. Verse 10. Now, can't you imagine? The king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew. Talk about busting your bubble, ruining your day. Go out there to Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. And everything that you just said you would do to someone who was honored by the king, you go do that to Mordecai. Folks, that's how you need to learn to be careful. Sometimes you have to eat crow. Sometimes you have to swallow your words. Sometimes when you think it's all about you, you wake up one day and realize that wasn't about me. People weren't thinking about me the way I thought everybody was thinking about me. And so sometimes we build ourselves, that's called pride. That's called ego. There's a lot of names for that. Ask Haman how he felt. What shall I do for a man whom I honor? So it's me. What do I want the king to do for me? And he does that for Mordecai. All of that. So afterward, all that was done. Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. In verse 13, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So now we're going back to the other banquet, to the second banquet. Haman, the king, and Haman are there. The king again says, verse 2, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Up to half of my kingdom it shall be done. That's when Esther says, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. So what's she saying? Verse 4. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. You follow on down what she is saying. Verse 8, the king returned from the palace garden to the place of banquet. Now keep in mind, he gets mad and storms out. Haman then begins to beg for mercy. Verse 8 says, when the king comes back in the palace from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. In other words, he's begging, he's pleading with her, and eventually, like he's down on his knees, he's fallen across her couch. And the king said, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? And as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And it says, and one of the eunuchs said to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. And the king said, hang him on it. Haman come up with this scheme to have the people of God annihilated. Build a gallows specifically for Mordecai the Jew. So what happens in verse 9? The king says, hang him on it. Twist of fate, a little bit of irony. The gallows that Haman had prepared to hang Mordecai on is the gallows that he himself gets hung on. And so Esther is used to deliver the people of God from the annihilation. Not only that, Mordecai, who was going to be killed by Haman, ends up in Haman's house. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. And on that day, King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king For Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then they go to the king and say, okay, this edict has gone out all across the land to annihilate all the Jews. What can you go and call that back? He said, no. But here's what he does say. Verse 8. Chapter 8. But you yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please. In other words, what do you want to say now? I can't just call off the order. So you figure it out. Whatever y'all come up with, you've got the signet, you sign it, you seal it, whatever. Whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke. And so they come up with a plan. Basically, they can't call it off, but what they can do is say to everybody, the Jews have a right to defend themselves and do what they want to do. That's a game changer. Not best, but it's what happens. But the interesting thing that happens is during all of this stuff, verse 12, on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. What's that date? The date of the casting of the lots. That date's important. We began with that date. We began with Haman casting lots to figure out what day there's going to be another Holocaust, another annihilation of the Jews. But look at verse 17. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So in the end, God gets the glory. God is the one who sees a way, and He does protect His people. He saves His people in such a way. Now keep in mind, God's not mentioned here. But the Jews are delivered in such a way that multitudes of people in the land, many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. Because the first part of chapter 9 talks about their destruction. Chapter 9 talks about also the Feast of Purim. But look at verse 14 before we move on. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree which issued in Shushan, there again, from the palace, from the capital, from the king's throne. Here's the decree. Commanded this to be done. And they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So verse 14, the king says, now go back and clean up this mess and eliminate the heritage of Haman. He will have no descendants. He will have no sons, no grandsons. Just kill them all, the descendants of Haman. Now your study guide says, look at 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 10. Go back to the divided kingdom. Solomon dies. Rehoboam becomes the first king of Judah. Jeroboam becomes the first king of Israel, the 10 tribes to the north. So you got Judah and Benjamin. Rehoboam's the king. The 10 tribes to the north, Jeroboam is king. Jeroboam is a wicked king, evil king. One of the first things he does is he sets up altars to Baals and golden calves and all of that stuff. Evil, wicked king. And God said, kill all the children, all the descendants, because Jeroboam will not have a heritage in Israel. So we see this, and first look at verse 14. The king says, okay, round up his 10 sons, hang them. Thought, well, that's kind of drastic. But you look back at what God did when Jeroboam was so wicked and so bad for God's people. Now, they split, yes, but they were still God's people. Remember what I said about the exile and the people who said, we like it here. We'll stay here. They didn't want to go back to Israel. What's God do? He takes care of his people. He loves his people. They're not where they ought to be. Probably they are content where they are. But God says, I'm still going to take care of you. You're still my people. He still loves his people. Now we come to the Feast of Purim, which is instituted here in chapter 9. They're still celebrated today. Look at what it says. The Jews in the villages who dwelt in the unwalled towns celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for the sending presents to one another. The sending presents, a time of celebration. Why? Because they had been delivered from annihilation. In verse 21, what's it all about? To establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Go back to some early chapters. Casting lots. That day of annihilation became a day of celebration called the Feast of Purim. Pur, P-U-R, means lots. It's the day of casting lots. Celebrate that day of casting lots. Not that they were set for or scheduled for annihilation, but that God delivered them. And so verse 23, the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun. Mordecai had written to them because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, all the Jews had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them and cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and destroy them. So that's where the Feast of Purim came from. You remember a few lessons back when I talked about the Hebrew language and Ayim. You know, Pur is like a lot. What's lot? Singular. I cast a lot. Normally y'all don't cast a dice. It's a pair of dice. Ayim, Purim, the lots, cast the dice, plural. So that little Ayim on any Hebrew word, and all throughout the Old Testament you'll find in Hebrew, the Ayim, seraphim, means plural, more than one. And so there's that summary. They write the letters, send those letters to everybody. And verse 30, Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth. And so this appointed time every year, now on the calendar, that annual celebration, the Feast of Purim, still today. Chapter 10 just simply says, Mordecai the Jew was second to the king and was great among the Jews and well received by the multitude of his brethren. That's an evil plan that God was able to totally change. Those who would do his people harm ended up paying an awful price for that. God's not mentioned, but God's all over it. God delivers his people. God will do the same for you. Don't get so preoccupied with everything else in the world or so overwhelmed by some things in your world that you let the good things fade. Don't get so preoccupied with things going on outside your house that you forget how good it is in your house. Don't forget the ways God has blessed you simply because you don't always get everything that you want. Esther is a book we need to go back and read. We need to learn. We need to study. Let's pray. Father, thank you for your word. I pray that you might help us to learn from it, that you might help us that we would apply those truths to our lives. There's a lot of people today who are hurting, who are in distress, who do not have answers. Lord, I suspect there's some people in our world today that are so overwhelmed by so many things that they've been blinded by Satan and are not able to even appreciate the good things that they have. Help us to know beyond any shadow of a doubt that regardless of where we find ourselves, you know where we are. Regardless of what we need, you know what we need. And regardless of how desperately we need you, Father, remind us that you are there and you're waiting to hear from us. And if we do not do what we ought to do in the place that you have positioned us and appointed us to be, if we are not the people that you want us to be, it just might be that you will use someone else to be a blessing. You may use someone else to bless, to use them as a channel of blessing. Father, help us not miss out on what you've planned for us. Help us to receive every blessing that you have in store for us. Help us to be the people that you have called us to be. For us in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.